The image of medieval Europa landscape of perpetual grime, universal stench, and people avoiding water as if it were acid is a powerful and enduring myth. Yet for centuries following the collapse of the Roman Empire, this depiction was profoundly inaccurate. The Roman legacy of public bathing, while never achieving the grandeur of the Thermae, persisted in urban centers, monastic orders, and even private households. The early medieval era, far from being a time of filth, was one where bathing was a social ritual, a medical necessity and a welcome pleasure. Public bathhouses, or stews, were common fixtures in major cities like London and Paris, places where business was conducted, gossip exchanged, and the body thoroughly scoured. Then came the hinge of history. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century shattered not just Europe's population, but its confidence in water. The prevailing medical doctrine of the time, rooted in Galenic humorism, held that disease was spread by corrupted air, or miasma, which entered the body through the pores. When physicians and common folk observed that individuals who used hot baths often contracted the plague simply because bathhouses were crowded places where disease was easily transmitted, they drew a fatal conclusion: hot water was the enemy. The logic, though flawed, was terrifyingly simple. A hot bath caused the body's pores to open wide, making the human vessel an easy target for the deadly miasma drifting in the air. Water, once a source of purification, was conceptually weaponized. This shift was profound. By the time the Tudor dynasty rose to power in the late 15th century, the cultural landscape of hygiene had utterly transformed. The once bustling public baths were viewed with suspicion, often repurposed as brothels or simply left to decay. An edict in 1546 by King Henry VIII closed several stews in Southwark, not just for moral reasons, but reflecting a broader societal rejection of communal water use. Elizabeth I, born in 1533, inherited a world where her ancestors' casual acceptance of the bath was considered reckless and medically dangerous. She was raised under the rigid medical orthodoxy that dictated a minimalist approach to immersion. The emphasis shifted entirely from washing off impurities to protecting the body from the entry of disease. One was clean not because one was frequently submerged, but because one's skin remained sealed, presenting a solid barrier against the invisible toxic air. The simple, pleasurable bath of her ancestors was now a radical act of risk. This profound cultural rejection of hot water for fear of opening the pores set the fundamental stage for Elizabeth's own lifelong habitza, crucial context for understanding why the woman who ruled England for 45 years would rely on perfumes and dry linen instead of the simple tub. Water had become associated not with health, but with the gaping maw of the plague. Stepping into the inner sanctum of a Tudor palace, the private rooms, or privy chamber, was a sensory experience defined less by clinical cleanliness and more by an overwhelming, orchestrated aroma. The shift away from bathing meant that cleanliness was no longer a state achieved by ablution, but a condition sustained by powerful, expensive fragrance. For Elizabeth, the air she breathed was the most immediate indicator of her health, her rank, and the security of her court. The reality of sanitation in even the grandest residences, like Hampton Court or Greenwich Palace, was challenging. Waste was dealt with through jakes or garderobe's primitive latrines built into the external walls, often emptying directly into the moat or a cesspit. While attendants, grooms of the stool, were tasked with managing the royal commode, pervasive underlying scent of human and animal waste was inevitable, especially in a densely populated court of several hundred people. This permanent atmospheric challenge required constant counteraction. The primary defense against the inevitable odors and critically against the dreaded miasma was a sophisticated regime of scenting. Floors were not scrubbed with soap and water, a habit deemed unhealthy, but meticulously covered in strewing herbs. These included fragrant plants like lavender, sweet woodruff, chamomile, pennyroyal, and basil. These herbs were changed frequently, crushed underfoot to release their volatile oils, covering the smells while simultaneously acting as a natural insect repellent. Beyond the floor, the walls themselves were treated. Fumigation was a routine practice. Frankincense, myrrh, and costly foreign spices were burned in censers to cleanse the air. But the most intimate application of fragrance was on the queen and her immediate environment. Rosewater was ubiquitous. It was used to wash hands before and after meals and to dampen linens. It was a sign of hospitality and refinement, far safer than ordinary well water. Clothing, too, was steeped in scent. The queen's voluminous silks and velvets were not laundered in the modern sense, but carefully brushed, aired, and infused with perfumes derived from musk, ambergris, and civitol, exotic, potent, and prohibitively expensive. Therefore, for Elizabeth, fragrance was status. The strength and quality of the perfumes she used were a tangible measure of her wealth and power. A sweet-smelling body and chamber signaled health, royal favor, and the ability to command the highest-grade protective barrier against disease-carrying foul airs. The notion that a person was clean by virtue of smelling beautiful was cemented in Tudor society. When an ordinary person could only afford to smear themselves with animal fat, the queen could afford the imported musk of a prince. When Elizabeth's attendants prepared her chambers, they were not just hiding. They were assembling a delicate protective cloud of scenta, visible, or rather, audible sign that she was insulated from the putrid, disease-ridden reality outside the palace walls. The privy chamber, as pervasive aroma, was the Elizabethan equivalent of modern sanitation, a public declaration that the body within was sealed, protected, and inherently royal. The shift away from bathing in Tudor England was not solely driven by medical fears of the plague. It was equally cemented by a profound religious revolution. When Henry VIII broke with Rome, initiating the English Reformation, the very definition of piety transformed. This shift subtly but powerfully impacted how the Queen, and indeed the entire nation, regarded the physical body and its care. In Catholic Europe, rituals involving water held immense sacred significance: holy water, baptism, and the washing of feet. While the Catholic Church had its own complex relationship with secular bathing, the public spectacle of indulgence and pleasure, particularly associated with the bathhouses of the continent, became a target for the rising tide of Protestant austerity. The burgeoning English Protestantism, championed zealously by figures during the reign of Elizabeth's brother, Edward VI, demanded a greater focus on inner spirituality. Piety was demonstrated not through ornate ritual, but through intense self-discipline, sobriety, and diligent work. The body, rather than being a temple to be purified through sacramental washings, became something to be viewed with suspicion, a vessel of earthly temptation and sin. The extended, luxurious bath, once a social norm, who's now dangerously close to being labeled as carnal indulgence. It represented sloth and sensuality, vices that starkly contrasted with the puritanical push for sober modesty. Why spend hours soaking in perfumed waters when that time could be spent reading scripture, attending to duty, or engaged in statecraft. The Protestant emphasis on spiritual hygiene over physical ablution led to a concept of cleanliness as godliness that was interpreted as moral purity, not literal immersion. The truly pious person demonstrated their commitment by maintaining clean linoleum, symbol of outward social respectability and moral rectitude, while dedicating minimal energy to the unnecessary pampering of the skin with water. This moral framework perfectly complemented the existing medical consensus. If hot water endangered the body by inviting miasma, and if luxurious baths endangered the soul by inviting vanity, the prudent and God-fearing ruler had a clear path: minimal immersion. Elizabeth I masterfully embodied this new, austere form of spiritual discipline. Though she loved fine clothes and jewels, which she justified as necessary for the dignity of her office, her personal life was marked by rigorous self-control. Her avoidance of the extended bath was not just a medical precaution, it was a visible sign of her dedication to the Protestant ideal of modesty and her rejection of papist luxury. In the Queen's court, the clean shift and the fresh, albeit dry, skin were acts of devotion. The scent of rosewater and clean starch signaled an orderly, disciplined body, mirroring the order she sought to impose on her kingdom. In this new religious climate, a little grime, covered by magnificent attire and overshadowed by sober duty, was a small price to pay for the visible purity of the soul. The Reformation had effectively transformed the deep tub from a tool of health into a symbol of moral weakness, solidifying Elizabeth's path away from water. If water was suspect and the bathhouse abandoned, what then was the Elizabethan secret to hygiene? It was a sophisticated, labor-intensive system based on dry cleanliness, where the barrier between the skin and the world was not a layer of perfumed oil, but an immaculate, constantly replaced garment, the linen shift. For Queen Elizabeth I, and indeed any person of means, the daily ritual of being clean did not involve a plunge into water, but a meticulous change of inner garments. The linen shift for women, or shirt for men, was considered the true cleanser. It was worn directly against the skin, serving as a highly absorbent, disposable layer designed to wick away sweat, body oils, and accumulated grime. This heavy reliance on linen was the era's solution to personal hygiene. The fabric was durable, breathable, and crucially, could withstand the extreme cleaning processes necessary to purify it. The daily change of the shift was the true Elizabethan bath. This was not a private act. The Queen was assisted by her ladies of the bedchamber, who would remove the soiled shift and replace it with a fresh, stiffly starched, and scented one. The feeling of cool, crisp linen against the skin was the tangible sign of purity, providing the sensory gratification a modern person gets from a hot shower. Once removed, the soiled linen became the subject of the era's most violent cleansing agent, lye soap. Lye, a highly alkaline substance made by leaching ashes, often wood ash, with water, was essential for the intense process of laundry. Clothing would be boiled in huge vats with chunks of this harsh soap-caustic compound that effectively sterilized the garments, stripping them of biological material, grease, and any potential residual foul air. This was not a gentle process, but the linen was built to endure it, emerging blindingly white a color that was itself a powerful signifier of purity and wealth. Only the rich could afford the sheer volume of linen, and the specialized staff required to maintain such an intensive laundry cycle. For Elizabeth, her ability to have daily, dazzlingly white linen shifts was a non-verbal declaration of her supreme wealth and orderliness. The doctrine extended beyond the garments to the skin itself. Though the queen did not immerse herself, she was not passively dirty. Her ladies would use fine cloths, often linen, to vigorously rub the skin, particularly on the arms, face, and neck, which were exposed to the air. This friction, sometimes with a little rosewater, served two purposes. It removed superficial dirt and dead skin cells, and perhaps more importantly, it was believed to seal the pores, providing extra protection against miasma, directly opposing the idea that hot water opened them up. In essence, the Elizabethan approach inverted modern hygiene. Cleanliness was achieved externally through absorbency and friction, rather than internally through immersion. The laundry basket, not the bathtub, was the centerpiece of royal sanitation. And the humble linen shift was the most powerful tool in the Queen's regime of dry cleanliness. The Queen's day began not in a relaxing bath, but in a meticulous, highly choreographed ceremony of dressing and preparation, overseen by the most trusted members of her privy chamber. This was her daily defense, a strategic process designed to transform the human body into the iconic, unassailable image of Elizabeth I. The ritual was intensely focused on surfaces and scents. Her massive, richly embroidered gowns, having been aired and perhaps lightly fumigated overnight with sweet herbs to remove any lingering foul airs, were brought forth. Before they touched her skin, however, the foundation of her dry hygiene was applied. The crisp, clean linen shift and stockings, the ultimate barrier. Next came the application of her famous, or infamous, cosmetics. This was not mere vanity, it was part of the political armor. To maintain the illusion of health and youthful vitality, a crucial aspect of a monarch whose age was often a political vulnerability, Elizabeth relied on a heavily pigmented face paint, most notably Venetian cerus. This toxic mixture of white lead and vinegar provided a stark, smooth, mask-like canvas. While dangerous, its thick texture offered a visual barrier against the grime of the world, creating the pristine, almost ethereal image that dominated her portraits. Her lips and cheeks would be rouged, and her hairline often plucked high to emphasize the intellect and majesty of her brow. The minimal use of water was confined exclusively to the icily exposed extremities. Rosewater was the Queen's most frequent liquid companion. It was viewed as gentler and purer than common water, often distilled multiple times. Her ladies would offer it in silver basins for the ceremonial washing of her hands and, less frequently, her face. This was a superficial cleansing, intended more to refresh the senses and set a hygienic standard for those who approached her than to penetrate the skin. Everywhere else, scent was paramount. Elizabeth's chambers were constantly filled with the rich, protective smoke of burning spices. More personally, she carried scent on her person via pomander's ornate metal containers filled with a ball of aromatic substances like ambergris, civet, and musk. Worn on a chain or placed on a table, the pomander provided a portable, powerful sphere of sweet air, warding off the dangerous miasma that lurked in crowds or less sanitary parts of the palace. The careful layering of her fineries, the farthingale, the stays, the petticoats, and the final gown, was a deliberate insulation. Her attire was less a fashion statement and more a physical scented fortress against the world. Every ruffle, every starched ruff, and every perfume-drenched layer confirmed the Elizabethan doctrine. Cleanliness was not achieved by washing off impurities, but by sealing them out. By the time the Queen emerged from her chamber, she was a masterpiece of scent, silk, in startling white lead a magnificent visual statement of her protected sovereign status. Her routine was a declaration that the state of her body was impeccable because it was insulated and perfectly scented, demonstrating that in the Tudor court external brilliance triumphed over internal immersion. In October 1562, Elizabeth I faced the greatest personal crisis of her reign, a moment that nearly ended the Tudor line and profoundly cemented her established habits of minimal immersion. She contracted smallpox. The disease was a terror, leaving behind either death or lifelong disfigurement. Elizabeth survived, but the experience left her physically scarred and intellectually terrified of anything that might compromise the delicate balance of her health. The presence of the smallpox scars, which she famously concealed with copious amounts of the toxic white lead makeup, was a permanent visual reminder of her vulnerability. But the disease's greatest lasting impact was the reinforcement of contemporary medical orthodoxy regarding hygiene. For the Elizabethan physician, the body was a finely tuned machine regulated by the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, especially a systemic shock like smallpox, threw this balance into chaos. Recovery demanded gentle restoration and the avoidance of any external force that might further destabilize the patient. And chief among the destabilizers was water. Following the principles established after the Black Death, medical practitioners believed that any vigorous change in external temperature or immersion in water could fatally shock the system. This was particularly true for a convalescent, whose pores were viewed as hypersensitized and whose inner heat needed careful protection. The worst perceived offense was the practice of washing or rubbing the skin vigorously with water, which was thought to draw essential heat out of the body, or worse, open the skin to the lingering miasma of the sickness itself. Elizabeth's doctors would have strictly enforced a regimen of dry care. Linens would be changed frequently, and her skin likely patted down with clothes dampened only lightly with spirit or rosewater at all around the affected areas. A full hot bath would have been regarded not as restorative, but as an act of reckless medical negligence, potentially inviting a relapse or another fatal infection through the open skin. Having survived such a devastating illness, Elizabeth was naturally inclined to trust the medical advice that saved her. The smallpox incident elevated her minimal bathing routine from a mere cultural preference to a deeply rooted survival mechanism. The scars beneath her makeup were constant proof that the body was fragile and that risk lay just beneath the skin's surface. For the rest of her life, the fear of shocking her system or compromising her skin barrier, fear amplified by the vivid memory of her illness, justified her already ingrained habits. The medical profession of her era, having watched the terrible toll of epidemics, had essentially mandated dry cleanliness as the prudent, aristocratic, and life-preserving choice. Elizabeth's recovery meant that for her, and for the court that watched her every move. Minimal immersion became the ultimate sign of good sense and regal self-preservation. In the elaborate hierarchical world of the Elizabethan court, few acts were more intimate or more politically charged than the daily ritual of dressing and undressing the queen. This private ceremony, conducted within the confines of the privy chamber, was not merely a functional necessity, it was the definitive act of her hygiene, the true royal bath. This intimate rite was performed by the ladies of the bedchamber, women of the highest social standing, whose loyalty was beyond question. To serve Elizabeth in this capacity was to hold immense privilege, for they were the only subjects permitted to see the monarch in a state of semi-undress, a moment of extraordinary vulnerability that demanded absolute trust. The ritual centered entirely on the linen shift. When the queen rose, the soiled shift, the inner garment that had absorbed the sweat and oils of the previous day and night, was carefully peeled away. This act required skillful handling, ensuring the queen's modesty was maintained even within the private room. This moment offered the ladies a rare and vital glimpse of the monarch's physical state. Given the scarcity of immersion, the removal of the shift was the primary opportunity to inspect the queen's skin for signs of illness, irritation, or fatigue. Any blemishes, rashes, or signs of fever would be immediately noted and reported a crucial, unwritten medical assessment that preceded the arrival of any physician. The body of the monarch was the body politic, and its condition was a matter of national security. The true moment of cleansing arrived with the replacement garment. The fresh shift, often made of the finest Holland linen, was starched, stiff, and frequently infused with the scent of rose or orange flower water. As the cool, crisp fabric was drawn over her head and settled against her skin, it represented a symbolic purification. The linen absorbed the grime, and the replacement signaled a new beginning. The feel of the stiff, dry textile provided the physical sensation of freshness that the era associated with cleanliness. This ritual was also a profound display of power. Elizabeth permitted only a handful of chosen individuals to attend her, reaffirming their status while simultaneously ensuring that no unsanctioned eyes or hands came near her person. The very act of relinquishing her modesty, even briefly, to these select few was a demonstration of her supreme authority and their absolute submission. The absence of a literal bath amplified the significance of this dry ritual. Unlike the fleeting satisfaction of a soak, the purity granted by the new shift endured throughout the day, constantly wicking away moisture and releasing a subtle perfume. It dictated the aroma and appearance of the queen until the ceremony was repeated that night. Thus, the changing of the shift transcended simple wardrobe management. It was a daily covenant of trust, a crucial medical examination, and the very definition of Elizabethan hygiene. For the Virgin Queen, the pristine white linen was her armor, her privacy, and her bath all in one. For Elizabeth I, the creation of an impeccable, eternally youthful persona was not vanity. It was statecraft. Every layer of powder, every sprig of lavender, and every drop of costly perfume was a deliberate tool used to project an image of untouchable, enduring royal authority. Her hygienic choices, particularly her preference for dry cleanliness and heavy scenting, were fundamentally intertwined with this political theater. The Queen recognized that accessibility bred contempt. In an era where the monarch's body symbolized the stability of the nation, any sign of human frailty, disease, age, or physical grime was a political weakness. Therefore, her physical appearance had to be idealized and distant. Her signature looked the striking white face achieved with ceruse white lead. The fiery red wig and the stiff layered gowns served to make her appear less a woman and more an icon. This carefully constructed facade was entirely incompatible with the vulnerability of a full hot bath. Immersion required the removal of the toxic serous, revealing the smallpox scars and the undeniable signs of aging. It risked shocking the system, as her doctors warned, and meant hours of meticulous repreparation to restore the regal mask. Politically, the risks of revealing vulnerability far outweighed the perceived benefits of a bath. Scent was a critical component of this political fortress. Elizabeth spent vast sums on imported fragrances, musk, ambergris, civet, and the purest rosewater. These were not merely used to mask ambient odors. They created an aura of exotic, expensive, and powerful authority around her person. When subjects approached the queen, the overwhelming, luxurious aroma was the first thing they experienced. It announced her presence, distinguished her from the less scented courtiers, and created an invisible barrier of sensory perfection. This heavy, deliberate use of perfume was essential to maintaining the image of an ageless queen. While the smells of the ordinary court sweat, stale linen, and chamber pots were ever present, Elizabeth's perpetual cloud of musk and rose provided psychological reassurance that her body was untouched by the common decay. She was the virgin queen, pure, untainted, and above the physical realities that afflicted her subjects. Moreover, Elizabeth expertly used gifts of scent to manage diplomacy and reward favor. To receive a scented glove, a box of Spanish paste, or a jeweled pomander from the queen was a signal of high favor. She used fragrance as a currency of status, reinforcing the idea that sweetness equaled power in her court. In essence, Elizabeth's hygiene was less about genuine cleanliness and more about effective optics. Her routine of dry linens, perfumed rooms, and thick makeup ensured that the physical queen was always hidden behind the immaculate, scented image of the crown. The full bath would have been an act of self-dismantling, an unnecessary revelation that Elizabeth, the shrewd political actor, was never willing to risk. Her avoidance of water was thus a masterstroke of perfumed power, as Elizabeth I moved into the final twilight years of her long reign. The foundations of the hygiene system she so rigidly followed began to show fissures. Though the queen remained steadfastly dedicated to the dry cleanliness of her youth, murmurs of change driven by intellectual curiosity and nascent engineering started to circulate, laying the critical groundwork for the later water-centric revolutions of the Georgian and Victorian eras. The most influential intellectual force challenging the old guard was the polymath Francis Bacon, a statesman and philosopher who served in Elizabeth's court. Bacon, though not directly advocating for frequent bathing, was one of the first influential voices to systematically question the old medical doctrines. He championed empirical observation and sought rational, rather than superstitious, solutions to the problems of health and comfort. While he still believed in the power of scented herbs and the dangers of extreme heat, his approach marked a philosophical shift toward active environmental control rather than passive acceptance of miasma. His work would eventually inspire later generations to focus on structural sanitation. Simultaneously, a tangible, if initially unheralded, revolution in sanitary engineering began during Elizabeth's reign, championed by her godson, Sir John Harington. In 1596, Harington devised and installed the Ajax, a flush lavatory that used water to seal the waste outlet and remove excrement. He wrote a witty but influential treatise describing the device, titled A New Discourse of a Stale Subject, called The Metamorphosis of Ajax. Harrington's invention was a direct challenge to the jakes and chamber pots that were the source of so much foul air. Though Elizabeth reportedly had one installed for her own use at Richmond Palace, she treated the device with skepticism, perhaps finding the continuous flow of water unnerving or simply unnecessary given her established habits. The Ajax was deemed quirky and was not immediately adopted by the court or the wider public. However, its existence demonstrated a pivotal truth that technology could be harnessed to manage waste and improve internal domestic sanitation using water, directly contradicting the ingrained fear of the element. These new currents of thought were slow, subtle, and often viewed with suspicion by the Queen's generation. They were the earliest indicators that the Elizabethan philosophy, where cleanliness was a defensive barrier maintained by scent, and linen was giving way to a new idea, that cleanliness was an offensive action achieved by engineered flow and structural reform. The age of dry cleanliness was ending. While Elizabeth took her last breath, shrouded in the traditional, heavily starched linens, the intellectual seeds sown by Bacon and the technological innovation demonstrated by Harrington were already beginning to grow, promising a future where water would once again be regarded not as a weapon of disease, but as the essential tool of health and modern civilization. Elizabeth I died in 1603, leaving behind a legacy of political genius, cultural brilliance, and an enduring mystery about her personal habits. Her passing effectively marked the end of the long reign of dry cleanliness in Western hygiene. By embodying the medical fears, religious austerity, and status symbols of her era, the Queen became the ultimate cultural landmark of a hygiene system predicated on linen, perfume, and the sealing of the skin. Her routine, the meticulous changing of the shift, the obsessive scenting, and the avoidance of the tub was a product of a world terrified of miasma and convinced that water was a conduit for disease. This doctrine of minimal immersion held sway for generations, but it was already beginning its slow historical retreat. The seeds of change planted in her final years, Francis Bacon's emphasis on empirical science and the technological promise of Sir John Harrington's water closet grew rapidly in the subsequent Stuart and Georgian periods. The eventual discrediting of the miasma theory and the rise of the Enlightenment's focus on material well-being gradually allowed water to be rehabilitated. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the wealthy began to tentatively reintroduce the bath, and by the Victorian era, frequent bathing became mandatory for health, morality, and social respectability, complete inversion of Elizabeth's standards. The story of the Linen Queen, however, persists, serving as a powerful, necessary contrast to the modern concept of cleanliness. Her life demonstrates that cleanliness is not a fixed, universal concept, but a historical construct dependent on science, fear, religion, and class. Sure, she was not dirty by the standards of her time. She was impeccably clean, representing the absolute pinnacle of aristocratic hygiene available in the 16th century. Elizabeth's impact on royal mythology is profound. The image of the aging, scarred, yet perpetually perfumed queen solidified the idea that the monarchy must exist outside the realm of common physicality. Her elaborate rituals, though driven by a fear of infection, contributed to the lasting perception of her as the Virgin Queen, a figure whose body was as untouchable and pristine as the nation she ruled. Ultimately, the answer to why Queen Elizabeth I never truly took a bath is a complex tapestry woven from plague panic, Protestant morality, lead poisoning, and political necessity. She avoided the bath not out of negligence, but because the highest science, the deepest religion, and the most compelling political strategy of her time actively forbade it. The Queen's life gives us the satisfying understanding that sometimes the cleanest historical figures are those who chose the dryness of the shift over the dangerous indulgence of the tub. Her legacy reminds us that even something as simple as a bath can be a matter of life, death, and the fate of an empire.